Welcome everybody to a global examination of LGBT workplace equality indices from myself, Luke Fletcher, and our co-author team, Phil Crean and Felicity Daly, who are also on the call, and Sean Pickler, who can't be on the call today. We'll be talking through our findings of this book chapter, particularly around 5 different indices that we're looking at. So this is just a quick lowdown on who we are and what our specialisms are. So I'm an associate professor at University of Bath in the UK, and I specialise in applied psychology and human resource management. I'm fairly new to the LGBT inclusion area, having specialised more in psychology of work and perceptions of human resource management practices. And I'm specifically look at LGBT inclusion and what that means on a daily basis for people's behaviour at work. So Phil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. My name is Phil Crehan. I'm an independent consultant and researcher. I really focus on socioeconomic development, human rights, and within that, absolutely LGBT inclusion issues. I guess I really tend to focus on 2 things. The first is generating data on LGBT people, and the second is really plugging LGBT people into economic development.
Great, and I'm Felicity Daly. I'm currently a research fellow at University College Cork, and I contributed to this research as an adjunct research fellow at the Australian Research Centre for Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University in Melbourne. My specializations are in health and well-being with a focus on public health and inclusion of LGBT people in terms of socioeconomic inclusion. I serve on the Research Advisory Board of Open for Business.
And just to introduce Sean, so Sean Pickler is a professor at California State University in the US, and he specialises in applied psychology and human resource management, similar to me. His research areas focus on work-family dynamics, as well as LGBT inclusion and exclusion at work. So this slide is really to just introduce you to why we came together in the first place and why we wanted to focus on this topic. And I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs. I'm sure most of you understand this much more than possibly we do. But what our main focus here was really about that we knew that LGBT inclusion across the world is particularly challenging, that some countries have really progressed some legal protections for LGBT people, and employment protections and so on, but some are actively kind of pushing back on this or are actively trying to avoid putting in more protective policies and practices. So we've got examples such as Hungary, Poland and Russia. So in that context, we were really coming together to think about what some of the progress have been and what some of the influences have been across the world in terms of particularly around equality indices and what influence they had on corporates. We know that there's tensions and difficulties, not just in kind of the labour market, but particularly in the culture of workplaces. And that's why we wanted to focus on equality indices in terms of what potential they were placing in terms of creating the dynamics for a more inclusive workplace culture and climate. And our kind of starting point was really around all of us were coming at different experiences and different knowledge bases, but we all came together because of our connection with LGBT civil society organisations or advocacy work that we were doing in different areas. And we came together because we thought, okay, there's something going on here that LGBT civil society are really trying to play a crucial role in advocating and promoting not just a wider social political change in society, but also trying to influence what's going on in particular institutions and organisations, particularly in the private sector. And we know of HRC in the US and Stonewall in the UK are particularly 2 well-known examples. So we wanted to have a look at those 2 in particular, but also drawing out from those what might be going on in other contexts, in other regions that we're not so familiar with. So there's been a move towards benchmarking in this area, where voluntary partnerships are being created with corporates and LGBT civil society organisations, and these have been more pivotal, or we've seen them to be more pivotal in terms of changing the dynamics going on in particular organisations and being more advocating change in senior leadership, for example, and HR policies and practices. So benchmarking efforts really about registering an organisation on one of these indices and checking them off on certain policies that they've got in place or haven't got in place, and then benchmarking those against other comparators, and then tracking and promoting those policies over time and seeing what's changed as a result. Most of these indices are centered around a particular country or region, so they might be centered, for example, on the UK context, or they might be broader and across different countries, but within a particular region, such as Western Europe or Eastern Europe. And a few are trying to embrace a more global reach or participation, particularly HRC, for example, and Stonewall, that might be centered around a particular country, but are trying to look at a more global outreach with their work. And the main logic behind the benchmarking movement is really about this sense that change, progressive change, can be achieved through focusing on the business case for diversity and inclusion, around encouraging participation across a wide range of sectors and different types of organisations, and creating a kind of sense of healthy competition between businesses and firms, which kind of tie into KPIs and other senses of them evolving and having a sense of competitive growth. So our general research rationale here was really that we wanted to offer one of the first cross-national analyses of various LGBT workplace equality indices. So we chose a number or scope that we thought that we could achieve quite an in-depth analysis on, that were current, and that could give us an indication of what's going on across different types of regions. What we found was there was a distinct lack of research on LGBT indices, and there's only really one paper that we found that critically applied a theoretical perspective on uncovering certain issues that were going on in trying to rank or benchmark LGBT inclusion. And so we felt that, generally speaking, there was really a lot being missed out in terms of the knowledge that could be gained and could be shared across different stakeholders, not just in the academic community, but in a broader stakeholders, a broader remit of stakeholders. So we're missing out on particular key patterns or trends that are going on, or might not be going on, what emerging best practices are taking place, and what some of the common challenges, particularly with those emerging, the emerging ones that might be showing really interesting gains, but actually might be coming up at a lot of barriers and challenges that we need to look at. So we wanted to uncover kind of critical observations based on a robust evidence-based approach to interviewing certain key stakeholders and analysing that data so that we could provide insight, not just for further research, but also practical inquiry and having some practical implications for a wider remit of stakeholders. So in terms of the scope of the indices that we included in our analysis, we looked at 5. And I think we also tried to gain access to a 6th, but we weren't successful in gaining that 6th one. But we wanted to focus on 5 that represented different ranges or different regions. So HRC is one of the most well-established indices out there. It started off in the early 2000s. HRC was founded in 1980 as a political activist committee, and since then it's been one of the more progressive organisations doing a lot of work in this area. And it's mainly based in the US, but has since had more of a global outreach. And they started work in the kind of corporate equality index in the 1990s, but it really gained traction in the early 2000s. So it's one of the longest established indices out there. Stonewall Workplace Equality in the UK has likewise been around for a fairly long while, and started off in the mid-2000s, having done some previous work in the kind of previous years to get the index moving. It's steadily grown since then, but it's expanded quite a lot in the last 5 years or so. The main difference between Stonewall and HRC is that HRC is mainly focused on the Fortune 500 companies and private sector organisations, where Stonewall mixes a range of different sectors, public, private and non-profit. We also have Fulcrum's Ukrainian Corporate Equality Index, and I'll let Phil introduce that index.
Yeah, so moving to Eastern Europe, and in particular Ukraine, there's an organization called Fulcrum, who works on a number of LGBT issues, one of which is how to engage the private sector on more diverse and equitable hiring practices. In 2012, they began a series of consultations with a number of groups, community groups, social groups throughout Ukraine, eventually launching the Corporate Equality Index in 2015. That went for 3 years and then has gone on hiatus in 2018 with the idea that it will relaunch again soon. So Felicity, I turn it over to you for South Africa.
Yeah, so I've focused on the South African LGBT Management Forum's Workplace Equality Index. This forum is a voluntary group of business sector leaders that came together specifically to advance LGBT workplace equality. In South Africa, the 1996 Constitution outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, sex, and sexual orientation. Still has a far further way to go in terms of recognizing gender identity and expression. And these business leaders wanted to work specifically on LGBT employee inclusion. They started their index in 2018 and followed that up in 2019. And I believe the pandemic has had some interference with their 2020 operations, but our analysis has focused on the data sets from 18 and 19. And Phil Frewer, presente in Peru.
Yeah, thanks. So we can turn to Latin America now and see that in Peru, there is another workplace equality index. This is by the organization called Presente, which also works on a number of LGBT issues, one of which is engaging the private sector. In English, that is called the Diversity and Equality Diagnostic. It started in 2018. It is one of the newer ones that we've examined and has gone up until this day with more and more participating corporations with each year.
Okay, great. So we've covered the indices and why we focused on them, a little bit of background. In terms of the methodology analysis, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but it's just to give you a bit more information about how we approach this. So we sought out doing semi-structured interviews. So we had a general set of questions and principles that we wanted to focus on with key informants who were involved in kind of either the key strategy of the index in their organization or were involved in some of the key implementation of it. So I think we interviewed probably around 3 to 4 key informants within each of the indexes or indices, and we analysed, we recorded those interviews and analysed them against particular questions that we wanted to ask. So various things around why it was developed, the methodology that they use, how they collected the data, how they ranked the data or ranked organizations, what kind of applications has it had, how have they evaluated things like impact, what's their future plans or future directions, what kind of common challenges they faced and how they overcome those challenges. And we undertook a kind of broad thematic analysis. So each of us analysed each of our own indices, and we came together to explore what the commonalities were, what some of the differences were between our findings, and then we mapped them using, and you'll see in a minute, the resultant tables, and we mapped them across different elements. Sorry, Felicity. So we compared So we mapped or compared the indices across 5 different particular criteria that we were interested in. The first was really looking at the content of the index and what it really covered, the scope of what it was covering, whether it only focused, for example, on LGBT issues and not on trans or non-binary or gender identity issues. How it approached the assessment of validation, how did it seek to look to place criteria on the evidence that was provided by organisations, and how did it validate that information, how it then ranked and benchmarked and rewarded organisations for taking part, or what kind of ranking they got placed in. How have they gone about getting participation from organisations on that reach and scope of participation? Are they only interested, for example, in only focusing on certain private sector organisations in that region, or are they interested in a wider scope of participation? And if so, if they had challenges in getting that wider scope. And then we looked at how transparent they were to organisations prior to them submitting their evidence for assessment. So to what extent were they giving organisations a lot of preparation and guidance and criteria, or whether they were setting general principles that organisations had to kind of interpret for themselves. And then what kind of wide applications has their index or the data from their index provided to those organisations, but also in wide applications to other stakeholders that might be interested in that index. So I'm going to hand over now to Phil and Felicity, who's going to talk you through some of the key findings on each of those 5 criteria.
Great, so we can jump right into the content of the index itself. I'll cover the US, Ukraine, and Peru, and then turn it over to Felicity for the UK and South Africa. We really couch this in terms of strengths on the top and the weaknesses on the bottom. That's really important for us, because in doing this, this index-to-index analysis, we're really able to pull what we think are emerging best practices, which we hope are beneficial to more organizations as they create their own workplace equality indices. So in the US, and again, looking at the HRC's Corporate Equality Index, we see that the strengths that emerge around the content itself is that there's a really wide breadth, and the details of within the index itself are really clearly articulated. So this includes not only hiring practices, but also workplace policies around culture and standards that are created, as well as how it interacts with the cultural context of being in the US. In that, it covers really good depth by stipulating strict rules that ensure stronger embeddedness. We see this again as a strength, because it's not that it's not that this index captures more superficial policies that were created at the last moment. This really sees that LGBT issues are really part and parcel of the corporation itself. And for all that, we consider those strengths for the HRC CEI. Some of the weaknesses that emerge is that the coverage is pretty much only applicable to larger organizations with dedicated HR functions. And this is what Luke mentioned prior, is that it's really only geared to participating corporations that are part of the that have 500 or more staff within their corporation. So that's predominantly multinational corporations, and really that's kind of missing out on kind of a swath of small and medium enterprises, and thus the indicators itself are really built around that large structure, which might kind of limit applicability to smaller corporations. Moving on, so we can jump to the third one, the middle one, in Ukraine, and that's by the Fulcrums, also the Corporate Equality Index. Some of the strengths that emerge is that the process itself by which they created the indicators in order to evaluate corporations. And this one is very unique in the sense that it wasn't only LGBT issues covered, it also included issues surrounding gender and disability, right? And really this emerged through 3 years of consultations and discussions with a lot of social groups. And really what came out of that was to say it's stronger if we evaluate all these issues together, particularly on LGBT issues, which face such a stigma within the private sector in Ukraine. So for that, we really see that as a strength to emerge, as being a much more holistic and robust examination of all sorts of issues around identity. Another thing is that it maps very well into national, regional, legal and rights standards. So not only for rights and standards that have been created in Ukraine, but also more European-wide policies by virtue of the European Union. So again, those are some strengths that we see. Moving on to some potential weaknesses. By virtue of having a lot of issues covered, it might miss out on the breadth and depth of it might really miss out on some of the more specific details of the LGBT experience, which is something that we actually can return to later. So, but also another thing with this index is that it only focuses on internal oriented policies. It doesn't quite look at how corporations interact in the cultural context of Ukraine. So moving on to the far right, we can jump to Peru. And again, this is by the organization Presente. Some strengths that emerge is that it was able to work with the HRC to adapt some of their indicators to the Peruvian context, which is great because when you learn from some of the more longer established indices, you can really choose which ones might work in the long term in the Peruvian context. Another one is that another strength that emerged with this is that it went through significant consultations with Peruvian LGBT organizations and also just members of the LGBT community, which of course allowed them to create more robust indicators in their index. Some of the weaknesses that emerged is that it may miss the depth as it's also only focused on internal oriented policies. So like with the index in Ukraine, by only focusing what's going on in the workplace, it might miss out on how the corporation interacts with the cultural context in Peru. And I think on that note, those are just little tastes of what emerged when it comes to the concept of those three indices. Felicity, I'll turn it to you for the UK.
Thanks. So looking at Stonewall's Workplace Equality Index, that's one with wide breadth, which provides some general guidance for participants. And it goes in deeper by looking at the experiences of various subpopulations of lesbian, gay, bi, and trans workers. The coverage, though, is more applicable to larger organizations with dedicated HR functions because it is very resource intensive to be able to respond to the full inquiry that's presented to the participating organizations. And as we've said earlier, that's outside of just UK FTSE 100 corporates. It's gone into the public sector and used more widely across all type of employment situations in the United Kingdom. Looking at South Africa's Workplace Equality Index, that's got, over the 2 years that it was established, the work that we analyzed, wide breadth and depth, and it was very much informed by Stonewall's methodology. But importantly, it's grounded in South Africa's own national employment inclusion legislation, which again, ensures that there is both race, sex, and parity, and the inclusion of people who should not be discriminated based on sexual orientation. That doesn't necessarily mean people who are LGBT feel particularly comfortable to come out at work, though, because in South Africa's policy efforts over the 27 years since the Constitution was launched, there has been more advancement of racial and sex inclusion in the workplace. So the coverage there is probably a bit general until this index is further established. So looking at our next set of factors, we'll look at our approach to assessment and validation of each of the indices.
So jumping back to the US and with the HRC's index, we saw that there's a really rigorous process guided by established principles. This sets a very strong standard because we know that it's methodologically sound and not in just 1 year alone, but from year to year. This is a really good practice that we consider a strength. Something that emerges potentially a weakness is that perhaps it's too transparent. And what do we mean by this? This might create a scenario in which a potential corporation might look to the indicators itself and maybe not feel the need to engage into this evaluation. So for that reason, we don't consider it definitely a weakness, but we're saying when there is such transparency, this could create some dynamics between emerging potential participating corporations. So jumping to Ukraine in the middle, some of the strengths that we saw emerged was really that it utilized the networks of partnering organizations to help implement the index. So not only was it fulcrum, but again, it was with organizations in the gender and disability space, and that really allowed them to engage more corporations that they otherwise might not have had that connection to. And that increased more participation in the 3 years that they were up and running. We saw that build each year too. We see that it was slightly of a lighter touch assessment in the sense that it was a newer index. They didn't want to go too in depth and potentially scare off participating corporations. So what they did was, they took it step by step with that lighter touch first, and then with the idea to do much more in depth in subsequent years. Some of the weaknesses with the Ukrainian index, again, this is not an inherent weakness. It's just by nature of being new. It's in an early stage of development. It's really in that process of finding its footing, seeing how it can really articulate the value proposition to more corporations to join, to implement the recommendations that they build later on. But again, this is, smaller index at first with the idea that it can be growing once it comes back from its break. So again, jumping now to Peru on the far right, it's very similar to Ukraine in the sense that they had a lot of partner organizations to help implement the index. This, again, really increased the number of participating corporations that came. Like with Ukraine, it had a lighter touch assessment as well because it was, again, newer and they didn't, again, want to completely scare off the corporations. So they had somewhat more of a less in-depth indicators created with the idea that they could begin to make them more substantial in subsequent years. They also use this as a way to deliver training. This is such a great strength that emerged that for many of the participating corporations, they came out of it and said, how do we become better? And they said, well, we've already evaluated you, let's turn this into a toolkit. And that's exactly what they did. Some of the weaknesses with the Peruvian index, like with Ukraine, it's just in the early stages of development. It's even newer. It's one of the newer ones. And they're really trying to, again, articulate that value proposition in the long term.
Thanks, Phil. So looking at the Stonewall Index in the UK, that's a very rigorous systematic process focused on the gathering of evidence and using a trained group of assessors that also have access to an employee survey to validate what the employer is saying about their workplace. So there's more of a holistic overview. Now, having said all of that, you can see that's quite labor intensive, and each employer that has to respond to this, does have to dedicate quite a lot of time and resource to get through the process. In South Africa, it follows a similar process from how both the HRC and Stonewall indices have developed. It is also evidence-based. The employers, and in this case, it's all private sector partners, will deliver evidence and upload that online. And it is assessed by a sort of external board of people who've been appointed to assess. And I'll just say again, this is all on an ad hoc and voluntary basis. There is no sort of paid for engine running either the index or the assessment process. I think a weakness here is that it doesn't yet include a staff survey. So there's no way to externally validate what the employee experience is, in response to what the employer has actually said about the organization. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide. We're in the interest of time. We might have to pick up our pace just a little bit.
Absolutely, happy to. So we're looking at ranking, benchmarking, and the reward system. And here I'll say that in the US with the HRC's index, it's quite visible in how it ranks those Fortune companies that join. These also inform other rankings, like, for example, best place to work, which isn't something else that the HRC does. It, of course, lists according to the scores overall by best to not so best. It also scores by theme. So I believe that entails a look at a sectoral breakdown, for example, as well, just one example. So these are the strengths that emerge when we're looking at the HRC's index, because it is a very innovative way of presenting how the corporations did. Some of the weaknesses that emerge is that potential weaknesses, it seems unlikely if it can cover country offices of those multinational corporations. So given that it works with such large corporations in the US, so many of these are multinational in scope. And what we do not see from the current iteration of this index is how actually those corporations with country offices everywhere implement in those country offices. There might be a very small capture, but nothing quite that says, show us the proof that in X number of country offices, these are being endorsed. And that's very important because given that the HRC's index is so influential in terms of the creation of other indices, but also how it works with corporations. So we do see this as a potential weakness. I'll be a little bit quicker when I turn to Ukraine. Some of the strengths that emerge, high scoring organizations have choice to be published in the report, ranked in order of score. That choice to allow them to be published, again, just doesn't scare them off, given that they're in, given that they are a newer index and there is the high concern of stigma within the private sector. Having the choice to be involved or not is very important to those corporations. Again, they can receive follow-up trainings, very important when it comes to that value proposition and pulling in more corporations later on. Some of the weaknesses potential weaknesses for Ukraine and their index. So again, it might be hard to specifically differentiate on LGBT issues and issues around gender and disability. This was really important because what actually emerged was an example of the government saying, we'd like to hear about your index when it comes to the indicators itself and how we can turn that into a non-discrimination policy at the governmental level. And what they did was they included issues around gender and disability, but excluded ones on LGBT issues. So that's what we see as a potential weakness by their process. It only lists higher performing participants as well, so there's nothing really said about those that didn't score as high, which could be an educational limitation for anyone who's reading this and wants to know more about the corporation they could apply to or buy from. So moving now to Peru, some of the strengths that emerged, in the classification, it listed them by inspirer, less advanced as beginner, and that's just a way of listing how corporations did without actually saying this is the first, second, third. Again, it's another way of not scaring off corporations and keeping them much more involved in the long term. They also provided follow-up trainings based on that ranking system of inspirer versus beginner. Some of the potential weaknesses, again, following what I just said, there was a challenge to know which organizations took part, and does not list any specific names of participating corporations, which creates an educational challenge for anyone looking at these corporations.
Thanks, Phil. So looking at the Stonewall Index, that lists online the top 100 ranked organizations, and it also provides awards for specific best practice areas. Now, the increased participation that's been seen in that index over a long period of time has led to a lower probability of getting into the top 100, and there is limited feedback for those who aren't part of Stonewall's program that is a paid-for program called the Diversity Champions Program. So we'll probably circle back to that. In South Africa, the published report details those highest achieving organizations. They came in as gold, silver, and bronze. But those that scored below the threshold of reaching bronze were not publicly reported. And I think that was to avoid, exposing organizations that are very nascent in their journey about really looking seriously at diversity and inclusion of LGBT employees. It is a challenge, therefore, to know which organizations took part and the progress that each is making. So I think over time that will have to be rectified. So now looking at reach and scope of participation, maybe we'll just highlight a few things here in the interest of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the US, the HRC, they have no calls to participate. It focuses on larger private sector corporations, of course, and participation rates have been rising. So altogether, we do see this as a very standard setting when it comes to engaging larger corporations. Some of the weaknesses, again, it doesn't focus on small and medium-sized organizations. The SMEs are not there. And in the US, there are a tremendous amount of SMEs that just can't be part of this process. In Ukraine, again, they allied with other civil society groups that allowed them to really boost that participation. No fee to participate, and it is, of course, also mostly focused on multinational corporations. There's just some of the strengths. To the weaknesses, significant challenge of engaging domestic organizations. This is really hard, and again, it really notes that at the domestic level of the private sector, that stigma has really made it into the culture of the workplace, which kind of had Fulcrum's value proposition limited right off the bat. In Peru, also no cost to participate. Most of the interest comes from multinational corporations, but really what that shows was there's a significant rise in interest to participate. So from the MNC level, they did see much more willingness to engage LGBT issues in the workplace, and that's a really good strength that they took with them to carry into building a larger cultural conversation on inclusion and diversity. Weaknesses, like with Ukraine, domestic organizations were not as interested to participate. Some were even a little bit hostile, according to our interviews.
Right, and this is definitely a trend. So going back to the UK, there's, as I started to touch on earlier, there's no fee to take part in the index itself, but Stonewall has established a diversity champion program since very early in this process, which basically then organizations pay for in order to get support around basically doing better, and not just to perform better on the index, but basically to start to ground in their employment policies, what can they do to start to really make some inroads on LGBT worker inclusion. There was a very wide range of sectors represented at the time that we conducted this research in 2019. There had been rising participation. Folks might be aware that in the news more recently, there has been withdrawal, particularly from a number of public sector organizations, from the Diversity Champions program, with an argument from government that there's a question about value for money on that. Overall, as I've mentioned, it's very hefty in terms of time and resources to participate, and therefore it is probably more difficult for small organizations and small and medium-sized enterprises to participate. The forum's work in South Africa also established itself on a no-cost basis. There were mainly a participation from multinational corporations, and I would say that was predominantly in the professional and legal services aspect. And so I think, what's been nice to see is that this is being led as a South African effort, but I think it's being led from individuals in those firms who've been exposed to working in other environments and are trying to norm those standards in a South African context. And importantly, the legal and policy framework is on their side from that. But from 2018 to 2019, there was some introduction of domestic organizations coming in, but it was a very, very small pool. So one would be hoping to see the participation of some of your big South African indigenous organizations participating. Now we're going to look at the extent of transparency and the wider applications from this work.
Yeah, so when we look at the transparency of the indices from the HRC, Fulcrum, and Presente, we actually see very transparent information online and when you reach out to them. So that includes methodology, indicators, and how it's been utilized, again, for the HRC, Fulcrum and Presente. And we do see this as a good strength, because not only does it provide assurance to anyone who looks onto this that the indicators are pertinent to the LGBT experience, but it also promotes education and capacity of other indices around the world to develop their own. When it comes to the wider applications and focusing just on the HRC in the US, this was a highly influential index around the world. Many of the interviews that we had with folks in other countries said that I actually worked at the HRC on the development of their own and turning it into something that's pertinent to their own cultural context. So again, this is a good strength because not only is it transparent, but it has actually worked with other indices on their own creation. When we turn to some of the potential weaknesses, again, for the HRC, we don't actually see we don't actually see a lot of data on employee outcomes. And given that this is one of the longest established index, and also one of the most influential, we were hoping to see something of a capture when it comes to the outcomes of the LGBT staff. So how does this go past the policies that are on the books, but how does that transition into their longevity in the workplace, their mental health, their productivity? That is something that we could examine later on. When it comes to the weaknesses of both Fulcrum and Presente, these are just, again, very new indices. In Ukraine, there's on hiatus again. But with both, their wider application is not quite necessarily there, although we do see some positive signs emerging.
Thanks, Phil. So going back to Stonewall's Index, they conduct their own analysis of the data and they facilitate sector-specific knowledge sharing networks. As can be seen from what we've looked at, it has highly influenced indices emerging in other countries. There's very limited information online about the methodology, and Stonewall has been found to be somewhat hesitant to share the indicators to the public. In the South African situation, the methodology, report findings, and indicators are all available online, which has increased awareness and some competition amongst those organizations. Again, those are multinational. And but the wider applications aren't apparent yet because it's been a small number of participants. So I think key findings here are a number of things that I think we want to touch on. All of them have ambitions to strengthen their capacity for long-lasting positive change. There's variation in terms of the extent in which a systematic review is in place. And I would say the three core areas for the future that informants shared with us is that they want to grow this, and they want wider participation. What I think we would like to see is more of a focus on the employee experience, the lived experience, and whether performing well on the indices actually relates to increased well-being amongst LGBT employees. We do have that very strong business case always that it increases productivity, but I think we'd also want to see, can we introduce some measures to focus on well-being? And Phil, I wonder if you wanted to come in on any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we hope to see is the need to validate employer data with employee surveys and our independent research to analyze this employer data. So when it comes to the indices itself, again, we engage key informants with the organizations who created them on their experience in the process and the outcomes from it. But when it comes to the actual private sector itself, something that they could really do is share in their own data, not only when it comes to how it overlaps with these workplace equality indices, but when it comes to other data on perhaps, self-ID, if they can do so safely, but also other challenges that their employers face when it comes to stigma, when it comes to being in more challenging contexts. All this could be analyzed by researchers everywhere, really to the benefit of the LGBT community, to the benefit of the corporation itself. We need to really be understanding the extent of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, how that interacts with the cultural environments in which they work, and what that means to the mutual benefit of everyone. We have articulated a a business case for LGBT inclusion, but really we need to go past that and see what that means for the fabric of this LGBT societies in which